A Plague Tale Requiem is without a doubt one of the best looking games currently available. This mostly comes down to its spectacular lighting and insane level of detail, both up close as well as far out into the distance. Recently, the game also received an update that gives us access to ray tracing, so I thought that now would be a good time to take a quick deep dive into both the presentation and performance. All the footage in this video was recorded on our SAPPHIRE Nitro RX 7900 XTX graphics card alongside the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X CPU. We've got 64GB of 3600MHz DDR4 memory, and the game is installed on an M.2 NVMe SSD. Throughout this video, we'll also be switching up the graphical settings, but we will be primarily looking at a 4K resolution. We used AMD Relive to record the gameplay, and Revertuna Statistics server with a custom skin for our performance overlay. So with all that out of the way, let's jump into the meat of this video. One of the first things that you'll likely notice upon jumping into the game is that there's been a substantial boost to raw geometric detail when compared to most other modern releases. Not only is this obvious when inspecting objects close to the camera, but also much further out into the distance than we're accustomed to. This is most noticeable when looking at the silhouettes of large structures, where small details such as misaligned bricks, window frames, and stepping of the tiles remain visible regardless of the distance from the camera. I even struggled to spot any sudden level of detail swaps when approaching faraway objects, having to switch all the way down to medium details before LOD switching became obvious. The end result of this is a game that manages to maintain a very consistent level of detail, both up close and far out into the distance. In turn, this helps establish a level of visual stability that we seldom see with modern real-time rendering, and this is most likely the main contributing factor when it comes to giving people that impression of next-gen visuals that so many people have been describing. As you can likely imagine, the more detail that you cram into a scene, the heavier the scene is going to become, and there's no getting around the fact that on the whole, A Plague Tale Requiem is an extremely heavy game in terms of its system requirements. While set to its ultra quality preset, and this is without ray tracing, the game at times can still drag out performance below our 60fps target. At times I just chalk this up to the ultra quality preset being one of those inefficient settings that offered very little in terms of graphical quality, at the same time as massively taxing our hardware, but I was wrong. Based on my own testing across multiple demanding scenes, switching from ultra all the way down to low would only actually equate to around a 15% uplift in performance, whilst also massively degrading the visuals. So what gives? Well, put simply, the developers have opted to restrict graphical scalability in order to maintain a certain level of fidelity. I say this because from a technical perspective, the game's actually very well optimized, as we can see when looking at the rather impressive rats and the large number of dynamic lights in a given scene. We can also see that from an applied optimization perspective, a lot of effort has gone into making use of technical trickery in order to maximize graphical fidelity without being too wasteful. Frustratingly, performance appears to be almost entirely dependent on resolution. I say frustratingly because this is one of the few graphically demanding games that have released recently without support for Fidelity Effect Super Resolution, aka FSR, meaning that if we want to use upscaling, we have to rely on the game's own upscaling tech. Now, whilst this does suck, I have to be honest, the game's own resolution optimizer doesn't seem too bad, most likely helped by the fact that the game's native presentation is already pretty soft, meaning that we don't lose much fine-grained detail when enabling it. Whilst we're able to maintain a good level of performance on the 7900 XTX, I would say that pretty much any graphics card from the previous generation or below the raw rasterization performance of the 7900 XTX/4080 is most likely going to need to look into using some form of upscaling or frame generation in order to maintain a rock solid 60fps at 4K. Even at 1440p, the game on previous gen hardware could be extremely taxing, with the 6800 XT struggling to maintain a solid 60fps. So even then, I would suggest dropping the resolution optimizer down to quality from ultra quality in order to maintain a more consistent experience. Now that we've established just how taxing the game can be, and before we jump into ray tracing, I want to ever so quickly dive into a couple of the more graphically impressive features, meaning both the rats and the fire. There's numerous points throughout the campaign where the game will quite literally throw tsunamis of rats your way, and these set pieces are incredibly impressive, and yet they're almost entirely faked. Sure, the game does have hundreds of dynamic rats on screen at any given time, but during the most impressive swarms, it's obvious upon repeat playthroughs that huge swarms have actually been pre-baked, with each individual rat following the exact same path each and every time that you play the section in question. Don't get me wrong, it still looks incredibly impressive, and there's still thousands of actual dynamic rats at the same time. I just wanted to point this out because it's yet another example of smart and effective technical optimization, though I do feel a little guilty about pulling back the curtain since a magician should never reveal his tricks. When jumping into photo mode, we can also see that the game is automatically culling any rats outside the player's field of vision, and the rats are greatly reduced in both visual quality and behaviour complexity based on their distance from the player. I'm sure that there's probably a lot more going on behind the scenes as well, stuff like instancing and the use of imposters. From a technical perspective, the rats are effectively just a very complex particle system, but that doesn't make them any less impressive during moment-to-moment gameplay. One of the most overlooked graphical elements based on the content that I've seen here on YouTube has got to be the game's fire propagation system. A set piece fairly early on in the campaign does kinda show this off, but since it's supposed to be an intense chase section, I'm not sure that most people would have paid much attention to the fire's dynamic nature. Basically, if you can cause a fire in thick grass, that fire will slowly spread and propagate to nearby objects, slowly burning them away. At points this can look incredibly impressive, and the fact that the flames have gameplay implications makes them all the more satisfying. But now that we've basically drowned the game in praise, let's finally move on over to ray tracing. Look, there is no denying that RT shadows in the vast majority of circumstances do look better, especially when you're quickly able to switch back and forth between RT on and RT off. The problem is, if I'm being completely honest, at a glance, I struggle to notice much of a difference unless of course I start consciously pixel peeping. In my honest opinion, when we're looking at ray tracing, we want to see some fairly obvious differences to compensate for the fairly heavy performance cost, and unfortunately, at least so far, ray trace shadows in particular just don't seem to offer that. To make matters worse, I'm not actually convinced that ray trace shadows in a Plague Tale Requiem are truly accurate, often seeming way too sharp when you consider the size of the light source casting them, which is not what you would expect when you are often dealing with literal flames. I also came across a number of areas where ray trace shadows just look plain wrong, such as this field where the shadows cast from a large tree effectively blacks out the grass whilst leaving the ground underneath effectively glowing. This isn't a good look, especially when in this specific scene we're quite literally taking a 40% hit to our frame rate, only to be left with what I would consider to be an objectively worse image. On average, across a number of individual tests, I'd say that RT performance hit was coming in somewhere between around 25 to 35%, however, there is a number of cases where that number can be bloated all the way up to 70 or even 80%. This mostly happens in scenes containing lots of thick fog or certain types of dense foliage, but when it did happen, it would often plunge us firmly into what I would consider to be unplayable territory. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the game does have a fairly decent resolution optimizer, and if we set that down to balance, we do, at least for the most part, get a fairly decent performance with RT enabled, but you'll find performance to be much more variable than native, and at times you're still going to experience some very noticeable drops. Ultimately, it's the variability that prevents me from being able to recommend that anybody, regardless of hardware, attempts to play with ray tracing enabled. Not only is the performance cost way too heavy to justify the visual gains, but I also came across way too many visual oddities to claim that the overall visual presentation was helped more than it was hindered. To be clear, I'm not hating on ray tracing, there's plenty of games out there already that can be visually transformed through its use, and I have absolutely no doubt that the future of real-time video game rendering is going to contain many different forms of ray tracing. It's just that right now we're still in a position where we need to be willing to make compromises in order to use ray tracing. Sure, there's exceptions. Spider-Man Remastered, for instance, manages to run exceptionally well with ray tracing enabled, but that's still the exception rather than the rule. Whilst I still believe that a lot of people will be willing to sacrifice the sharpness of a native image, and maybe even a few graphical artifacts, I don't think many are going to be as willing to sacrifice playability in terms of frame rate, especially when we're talking about sub 60 FPS gameplay. Look, I'm sure that there's people out there that still believe that graphics trump frame rate and are going to play the game with ray tracing enabled regardless, and that's cool, you do whatever makes you happy. I just personally believe that if I have to literally start searching for the ray tracing advantage, it's probably not worth the rather substantial hit to performance and image softness. At the end of the day, ray tracing enabled with the resolution optimizer set to balanced is going to give you a pretty decent experience with averages around 60 and lows in the high 40s, which is perfectly playable on a decent FreeSync compatible monitor, though at the same time, if you're willing to use the resolution optimizer with ray tracing disabled, you're looking at 90 FPS as your lows with averages way above that. For me, input latency and frame time stability are key components to my enjoyment with video games. Stutters and sudden drops in frame rate and major graphical artifacts are the kind of thing that can pull me out of an experience in an instance. Granted, a Plague Tale Requiem isn't a game that really benefits from super high frame rates and low input latency. I mean, there's a bunch of auto-aim on your weapons, you're never really expected to have split-second reactions, and movement in general is very slow and deliberate. However, I'd also argue that A Plague Tale Requiem isn't a game that really benefits from ray tracing, so don't be feeling like you're missing out by having it disabled. But with all that said, I think I've touched on everything I wanted to cover in this video, so if you're still here, a massive thank you for stopping by, and if you've got any questions, suggestions, or feedback, you can let me know in the comment section down below. If you've not done so already, you can also slap that subscribe button and ring that bell so you'll be notified of our future uploads. For now though, from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, thank you so much for stopping by, and until next time, we'll catch you later, bye bye.